It's the week ending Saturday the 27th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen 2 former US presidents receiving bombs in the mail, Australia apologising to victims of sexual abuse, and reports of internment camps in China for an estimated 1 million Muslim citizens. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Holden, Frith and Hollie Clemence. And starting the show this week, it is Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Could the world actually need a new arms race?
They have not adhered to the spirit of that agreement or to the agreement itself. Russia. China's not included in the agreement. They should be included in the agreement. Until they get smart, there will be nobody that's going to be even close to us.
Never knowingly interviewed away from Air Force One. That was Donald Trump in typically defiant mode on Monday. Now, Rebecca, this was major news all day, wasn't it? Leading the bulletins. Why are you bringing it to our safe space?
Yes, it was big news, but I don't think it really got the coverage it deserves. It's been really overshadowed by the US's row with Saudi Arabia. Basically, the story, as you probably have heard, is that the US is going to pull out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed with the then Soviet Union in 1987, and it basically curbs the use of short and intermediate range nuclear missiles. So that's ones with a range of between about 300 and 3,000 miles. Basically, the US says that Russia has been violating it. Russia also says that the USA has been violating it. But the real story is why the US is pulling out of the treaty. It was I don't think it's really been reported on.
Go on.
In depth enough, because a lot of outlets kind of portrayed it as a sort of he said, she said kind of thing.
What is
Russia.
The real reason then?
The real reason...
What aren't we hearing, Rebecca?
The real reason
Bring us
is
the
not
truth.
to do with the US or Russia or Europe, which is where all of these, original missiles were stationed during the Cold War.
Yeah.
It's to do with China.
Ah.
China is not a signatory of the treaty.
Well, it's bilateral.
Yeah, exactly. And China has been building up its own nuclear program, which it didn't really develop so much in the past. It's now putting a lot of extra money into its defense spending. It's getting very bellicose in the Asia Pacific region, and the USA is getting increasingly worried about its bases in South Korea, Japan, Guam, which are now all within range of Chinese missiles, and it can't build any there in response because of this treaty.
Okay, Holden, do you agree? We don't hear enough about what China is up to with its nuclear weapons program.
I do agree, actually, and this is a story that I changed my mind on as I was reading up on it. And I think when I first saw the headlines, I had fallen into the trap of thinking that anything Trump is doing must be wrong. And also, it's on the face of it, it sounds like a bad thing, the idea that treaties limiting nuclear weapons are being abandoned. Reminded me of the episode of Yes Minister, where Sir Humphrey's warning the Prime Minister not to use the hotline to Moscow because it tends to cause panic. And he says panic is best avoided when it comes to nuclear weapons. And the sort of immediate worry is that, well, if the US says it's not going to abide by this treaty, then China will ramp up its weapons production. It may cause panic in North Korea, Pakistan, all of these places that feel they may come under threat. But as Rebecca said, the sort of risk of proliferation is already there. And
so talk me through the logic. I still don't quite get it. Like, Trump backs out of a treaty with Russia, which says they're both going to stop producing more nuclear weapons. And that's good in terms of curbing China because what? It means that there'll be a new treaty involving them.
Well, that's the theory.
But that hasn't happened yet.
No, but this is actually how the first intermediate range nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF for short, came about. It was during the late 70s, the Soviet Union developed a lot of these medium-range weapons and stationed them pointing at NATO allies in Europe. And the US at this point was actually caught on the hop. It didn't really have a way of responding to that. So it developed its own weapons, based them all over Europe, including in the UK at Greenham Common. And as a result of that balance of power, it at the same time started negotiations with the Soviet Union, and they led about a decade later to this agreement, and then they eliminated entirely this class of weapon. So the view that this is a good thing does depend slightly on one very big assumption, and that's that Trump can also pull off the diplomatic coup of opening negotiations with China and then subsequently persuading them and Russia to back down as the US downgrades its forces.
And why not do that bit first?
Well, the reason that that's unlikely to happen is at the moment the US doesn't really have any leverage because it is restrained by this treaty from building up its own forces in the Pacific.
So this is what you were referring to with war games, Rebecca. The idea is we're going to seem like we might want to accrue more nuclear weapons. That will frighten China into having a conversation with us, and then we can involve Russia as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a...
Is Trump that skilled? Is that really what's happening?
I mean, it's hard to say. He's definitely, he's cultivated some, a bit of friendship with Xi Jinping. He obviously sees himself as a great friend of China. I don't know if China sees him the same way. But this is definitely, if the US does go through with building up its intermediate range missiles in its Asian bases, it will very much still be a gesture because the INF Treaty and other missile treaties, they don't cover missiles launched from aircraft, from the sea, which are all, and nuclear submarines. These are all options that the US now has at its disposal. So if the US needed to take military action in the Asia Pacific, it easily could with the weapons it has already.
Okay. Holly, if Holden and Rebecca are right in that Trump is doing this to try and involve China and leverage Russia, then by definition Obama was wrong to extend the treaty with Russia that's been extant since the 80s. Do you believe that too?
No, because they've been trying to persuade Russia since the Obama administration to slow down and not have these nuclear forces. They don't want China to, they don't want Russia to. I don't think they necessarily want to build up their own. But Trump has failed to do that as well. He's failed to persuade Russia to stop testing out its missile, failed to get China to sign up to a similar treaty. And he is a man of disappearing, walking out on international treaties. I can't see him trying to build them up. I don't think that will be in his term.
But
I think
back to my question, should Obama have signed it? Should Obama have extended it? Because all these factors were still at play, weren't they, 4 years ago?
I think he was hoping, because behind the scenes he was trying to persuade Russia to comply with the treaty. So I think that's what he was hoping rather than pulling out.
So should Trump be hoping as well, like Obama did? Or is it can you actually understand where Trump's administration is coming from, that hoping isn't going to work anymore?
What we should all be hoping for is that Trump's successor is more in the mould of Obama than Trump. So in a way, the ideal situation could be Trump creating the leverage and the sense of an alternative path, and then somebody else coming in who is able to do that more skillful diplomatic negotiation. There was an idea that Trump himself was some kind of strategic 10-dimensional chess player. I think those people are getting smaller and smaller in number by the day. So I certainly am not trying to suggest that Trump himself will be able to negotiate an end to nuclear weapons in the Pacific. But it may be that this sort of seeming hiccup in the road is actually is a way of getting to that position that at the moment would be slightly more difficult.
And Rebecca, if he isn't seeing 6 moves ahead, could it be that he's just trying to engage his base ahead of the midterm elections and you've fallen for it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's obviously political jockeying at play, and any time Trump says he's going to pull out of any treaty, it seems to be met with, a rapturous response.
But particularly his style of Republican voters, they like the US military, they like playing hard, they don't like Russia.
Yes, then they
this
don't
plays
like.
Well.
I think there's a very strong sense they don't like rules, especially rules against military manoeuvres. But to go back to what I said in the intro, I mean, it was a bit tongue in cheek, but I think what this whole kind of messy debate really shows is that the protocols we have in place at the moment on nuclear weapons are outdated. They are kind of rooted in that Cold War mentality, and the real kind of geopolitical players, such as China, and then we've got India, Pakistan, Iran as well, all coming through. They're not affected by a lot of these treaties, a lot of these agreements. Although I did mean it in a tongue-in-cheek sense that it would be a good thing to have a new arms race. Maybe it will take something like that, an arms build-up in the Asia Pacific, and even more global tension before we can start to get to a place where we can agree some new treaties that tackle the new geopolitical setup.
Holden, you're next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Here's why South Koreans won't be getting high on someone else's supply.
Question Question. Should I come to Korea and just do a bunch of drugs?
No, dummy.
Question. I'm from a state in America where weed use is legal. Is it legal in Korea too?
No, dummy.
A friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of mine said that they totally did lots of drugs in Korea. It should be fine for me too, right?
No, dummy. If there's one thing that you're gonna walk away from this video with, it's this. Don't do drugs in Korea, dummy.
You want to get passo drunk on the street?
Fine.
No problem.
Drink yourself into oblivion. This is the country for that. But drugs, don't do it here.
That was Simon and Martina offering their wisdom on local drug laws. You can find more on their YouTube channel. Holden, what's the story this week?
The story this week stems from a story last week when...
Oh, you're all bending the rules today, aren't you?
It only stems from a story last week when Canada said that use of cannabis would be legal throughout the country.
Yeah, they didn't just say it, they did it,
They
didn't
did
they?
it. Or so we thought, because what happened this week is the situation turns out to be not quite as clear-cut as we thought, not because of the Canadian law, but because of various other countries attempting to extend their own laws beyond their boundaries. So the first little wrinkle that emerged was the US said that it reserved the right to ban Canadians for life from US territory if they admitted to drug use.
Wow.
Which
that is underreported.
Has
mental.
But even more mental, I think, to use your phrase.
I'm Simon and Martina-ing this up.
But what's even stranger is the decision by the South Korean government to warn its own citizens that if they use cannabis in Canada legally, they will face prosecution when they return to South Korean soil, and they could face up to 5 years in jail or a fine of £34,000.
Can they do that?
Legally, they can. This is an example of what's called extraterritorial jurisdiction. It's a relatively rare phenomenon. The most common everyday use is actually on planes and ships. So they're governed by the laws of the country they're registered in, which means that if you had two planes crossing over the same bit of the mid-Atlantic, a British Airways plane could legally serve alcohol to an 18-year-old. An American Airlines plane would be breaking the law in doing so. But in terms of whole countries reserving the right to pursue their citizens, regardless of territory, France actually reserves this right in theory in its penal code, but very rarely actually follows it. It really seems to be only South Korea and Japan that do this in any practical way.
Holly, I'm struggling to think of comparables. I mean, even really hardline Arabic regimes, for example, don't insist that women behave modestly when they come on holiday to London, for example, do they? Like, it's a bit of a fruitless exercise.
You might think that, but actually in the UK, there's surprisingly quite a few things that you shouldn't really do abroad and you could get in trouble for. Like Holden's correct saying most countries assume the jurisdiction is based on the territory where the crime happens, but there's also exceptions, which is based on the offender or the victim, their nationality.
Go on.
So, say, forced marriage, for example. If someone, a British national, went out, there's recently a woman that's been prosecuted for sending her daughter to Pakistan to marry a man who was double her age. That was in a different country.
But could you argue that the sending bit was the crime?
Yeah,
and that
there is
happened
part
in the
of that.
UK?
There's a conspiracy side of it.
They're not saying the marriage is illegal because in Pakistan it is legal.
There are circumstances where Britain could argue that we want to bring that person back and prosecute them here, especially in very serious cases like bribery, rape, murder.
And you can be prosecuted in the UK for committing child sex offences abroad.
I was going to say Gary Glitter, that was one of his charges, wasn't it? Something that happened in Vietnam or something.
Even though in this, in the instance of South Korea, it sounds a bit kind of comical and overbearing, I think there are circumstances where this kind of law can be used for good, to stop people, going abroad to commit these horrible crimes on foreign victims.
But theoretically, Holden, I mean, I understand it can be used for good, but theoretically, everyone should have rules against child sexual abuse and everyone should have rules against forced marriage. I don't think that's a Western perspective necessarily, whereas drugs law is something that each country has historically decided for itself. There have been countries that have prohibited things and there have been countries that have grown things openly.
Yes, and we were talking about the sort of particularities of South Korean culture a few weeks ago, and I think this is actually another case that where there's a specific cultural sensitivity around drugs. It has very strict rules against drugs and describes itself as being drugs-free. I read a report in the New York Times which suggested that cannabis had actually been introduced to the country by American troops during the Korean War, and I wondered if that is part of the...
Love this kind of historical detail that Holden brings to the show.
And I did wonder if that does help to explain this particular law, because if it's seen as something that's foreign and being imposed on a purer culture, the idea that people might go from that country overseas and kind of indulge in this foreign vice could be seen as more of a threat to culture than in other cases.
I think also what you said kind of belies your views, because there are countries that have differing ages of consent. And there's countries that are completely against drugs. And I think if you were very against drugs, you might have a different opinion on whether it's morally, whether you have a moral obligation to stick with your own laws from your own country. And there are countries where forced marriage is okay, and people would argue that it's okay, I think, because we've got quite liberal views,
yes,
it would be different.
I see your point, and yes, I was belying my own opinion. But on the other hand, the point about laws against child sexual exploitation is you are harming the child. The point about drugs laws, you're harming yourself. Perhaps not in a situation where it's illegal and so there's trafficking involved to get it to you. But if you're taking a recreational drug and it's your choice.
No, of course.
It's also about, different conception of how you belong to a country as well. It sort of reminds me of, whenever you go on a school trip, before you got on the coach, the teacher would say, now remember, when you go out there, you're representing X school.
Yeah.
There is also that element of it too, of it's a different way of conceiving your nationality and your belonging to your country, is that the South Korean government is saying, we are watching you while you're abroad, and we want you to behave in accordance with what we believe is correct behaviour for a South Korean citizen.
Yeah, that is an interesting point, isn't it, Ollie? It's a bit like sort of English football fans going to watch the European Cup or whatever, isn't it? Drinking too much.
There is a line in the New York Times report on this story that says that the whole of the criminal code, that South Koreans are subject to it wherever they are. So I'm not sure if it is just the drugs or whether they have to abide by all the laws, but that's such a difficult thing to police if you're in another country, unless you're boasting about it on Facebook or you come back high, whether they could actually follow that through.
Well, this is it, Holden. What are the plans? Is the idea that you come back from Canada and you have to have a blood test?
No, there haven't been any suggestions along that line. The South Korean embassy in Ottawa issued a statement saying, essentially a warning, just saying, if you're in a cannabis legalisation area, please be aware that if you're a citizen who takes part in cannabis smoking, including purchase, possession or transportation, you will be penalised for committing a criminal offence.
But how? They haven't said how.
But they didn't say how. And so reading between the lines of this, I wonder if there's 23,000 South Korean students in Canada. It's one of the main foreign destinations they go to. So I wonder if it's actually to try to prevent what Holly was suggesting, that people boasting about it on Facebook and Instagram and almost sort of advertising, the ability to go abroad and get stoned in a way that isn't permitted in South Korean culture. So it's more about preventing the appearance of impropriety rather than necessarily suggesting that they're going to try and hunt down people who've smoked once in Canada.
I suppose it would sort of encourage you to behave more responsibly as well if you were one of those students. You would be consuming it probably in your own dorm room, wouldn't you? You wouldn't be doing things that are illegal, like getting high and driving, for example.
Yeah, going back to the good old-fashioned days, where you had to lock yourself away in a closed room. There was no posting any pictures on Instagram.
But you certainly wouldn't want to get in trouble with the Canadian police, because then it could get traced back to your home country, couldn't it, I guess?
No, and I wouldn't head back to South Korea wearing your big marijuana leaf T-shirt either.
Have Canada done designs where they've got the maple leaf in front of a marijuana leaf yet? It just occurred to me.
I've seen flags at protests and celebrations.
Right, fine.
That. So,
it was an obvious idea.
That market's already been cornered.
I wasn't copywriting it. I was offering it out there for anybody who wanted to get involved in the merchandise side of things. Actually, we don't talk about marijuana often on this show, which is interesting in a way, because probably had this happened 5 years ago, if you see what I mean, if we'd have been doing this show then, the legalisation of cannabis for recreational use increasingly in democracies across the world would have been a story. It actually isn't now. We're talking about Canada's legalisation because there's opposition to it in South Korea, not because anybody's surprised that Canada's doing it. How long is it going to be before it happens here?
The debate's really stalled, I think. I really don't think... It's like with gay marriage. I felt like once one country did it, then you heard more about it in other countries, and then it became part of the debate in the UK. But I don't know, it sort of feels like we're sitting this one out.
It's slowly getting there with cannabis oils after the case with Sajid Javid has accepted that some people might need cannabis oil for
terminally ill children and things like that.
And epilepsy. So that's slowly come in to law, kind of creeping in that's allowed. So I wonder how long it will be. Theresa May has been very staunch about it, and I'm not sure if her very conservative followers would accept it yet. And maybe that will be the turning point.
Be perfect trade negotiation for Brexit, though, wouldn't it? New industry.
It could be. I was actually going to go off on one small tangent. Just the mention
How
of
unlike you.
the mention of gay marriage reminded me of there's another case actually of extraterritorial jurisdiction having more of a consequence, which is that, as I mentioned earlier, cruise ships are governed by the laws of the country they're registered in, and for a lot of liners, that means Bermuda. P&O and Cunard, all of their ships are registered in Bermuda.
I feel a fun fact coming along.
Which briefly legalised gay marriage, and so there were gay weddings aboard cruise ships, but it then reversed that decision earlier this year, and Cunard and P&O had to cancel all of the same-sex weddings that had been booked for the forthcoming seasons, and it left anyone who'd been married at sea aboard one of these Bermuda-registered vessels in a kind of legal limbo.
Thank you for bringing another unwrapped story and sneaking it onto this week's edition. Well, Holly, you are our final contributor this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is our niceness going up in the big smoke?
Malley arrived here at Oxford Circus at 9:32 this morning. He had already said hello to several people en route from King's Cross Station, leaving worried commuters unsure why a man they did not know was talking to them.
He made direct eye contact and then said, "Morning." First I thought, well, is this just a statement? Because, I mean, it was the morning, but no, something in his tone suggested this was a greeting.
Malley was apprehended by London police, who were forced to let him go, as friendliness to strangers is not a crime until next year.
That was a clip from the BBC comedy The MASH Report, a new series of which started on Friday, incidentally. Holly, what is your story of the week?
So it's a study by the University of Miami that asked 200 subjects to make decisions about making money, investing it and sharing it and giving it to charity. And they did it at one point, and then after a month they did it again. But the first time round, the participants realised it was anonymous and it basically had no impact because nobody was seeing how good they were being. And the next time round, they were 20% less likely to share with charity. So the researchers say that because we're moving to big urban areas, we've got less impact is seen when we do nice things, basically. So if you were likely to say thank you to a waitress and leave her a tip, you might do that in your local village because you'll see her again next week. In London, it doesn't happen because you won't be there again. It's full of strangers. It's a faceless city. So you're more likely to be rude and unfriendly in a big city than you are in a village area. As the world becomes more urbanised, the UN saying like 68% of us are going to live in urbanised areas by 2050, does this mean we're all going to get less friendly? The researchers say we've evolved from Stone Age times to learn to be nice to each other, but that's now reversing because we're all living in these urbanised areas. We're becoming a bit more selfish.
Rebecca, you used to live not in the city, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And now you do very much live in the big smoke.
Yeah.
Have you become less friendly as time's gone on? I mean, you appear to have, but I don't know.
You didn't know me before.
I didn't know you then.
No, I wouldn't. I don't think that I have. Part of me wonders if it's a bit of a misdirection, though, really, because it's the idea that we were. I certainly don't imagine that we were overly nicer to one another in Stone Age times. There's kind of tribal loyalty, but Stone Age people did not encounter strangers very often, and when they did, I think for all the evidence of skulls with big gaping axe holes in them shows that they weren't particularly friendly to them, and so I think this might be a bit of misdirection because I think when we are with people we care about, whether we're in an urbanised area or not, we are just as friendly and, considerate of them either way. It's just that we're meeting strangers a lot more when you're in an urbanised environment.
Yeah, but perhaps you're more likely, I don't know if this was in the research or not, but perhaps you're more likely if you live in an urban area to identify those feelings that you feel towards people that your friends and family, to people of, I don't know, the same social class as you or people of the same ethnic group. A city is a melting pot, isn't it? And that's the thing. Whereas in a village, in a rural environment, no matter who you end up living next door to, you probably will speak to them.
Yeah, and I think that can actually be one of the advantages of what might be seen as selfishness in cities can actually, there's a grey area between being helpful and being a busybody. And I think in, some smaller rural communities or maybe other countries where you have this closer knit community of friends and family, there can also be a feeling that everybody's in everybody else's business and everyone has to answer to everyone else. And so I think that the kind of anonymity in cities that can lead to exactly this kind of selfishness can also be hugely liberating for people if they don't feel comfortable in those kind of communities.
Yeah, and it can also be very claustrophobic in, say, London or another, large city compared to in a smaller place. When people do try and intervene in some way in your life, people will say, people who aren't from London will come to London and say, well, no one speaks on the tube, no one makes eye contact. But that really is just that's everyone collectively pretending that we're not in a hugely undignified situation where our personal space is incredibly compromised all the time. That is one way of holding on to, some of your self-respect, is to pretend that you have more space than you do. And that is aided by everyone collectively deciding not to interfere in everyone else's business.
And acknowledging that everyone else in the tube carriage can hear the conversation as well. I mean, that's often a point that's missed, isn't it?
Well,
not
that's
everyone
the worst,
is comfortable with broadcasting all their personal details.
Well, personally, this is the reason that I don't like interacting with strangers in public. I've had some great interactions with strangers in public, even in London, but it's not the talking to them, it's the fact that there's 60 people immediately within earshot who are thinking, oh, poor girl, that man keeps talking to her. That's the embarrassing part.
Okay, but that's a bit of a get-out clause, isn't it, Holly? Because, as you suggested by picking that clip talking about the difference between northerners and southerners, there are big cities up north. You can be from Manchester or Liverpool or Newcastle or Sheffield, and you are more likely to approach strangers in the street and have a chat. So it's not just about being overheard by other people. Those are densely populated areas.
Sure, and there's obviously cities around the world as well that you could argue are probably friendlier than London. Maybe it's a London-centric thing, which is perfectly illustrated when they tried to do badges with tube chat written on them. And it was just a massive flop because nobody wanted to chat on the tube or advertise that they wanted weirdos coming to talk to them on the transport system.
I think it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Because if I go somewhere outside of London and someone starts talking to me, my defences are immediately lowered because I think, well, it's not unusual for people to do that here, whereas in London it's the opposite.
You sound like Spock.
Yeah,
I believe the local custom here is to engage when communicated with.
But you just... It's if you know that you're in a less urban and friendlier environment, then you are more receptive to someone trying to talk to you, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you're in London, if someone talks to you, you know immediately that they are weird.
I mean, Americans listening to this will struggle with this conversation, I think, because even if you're from New York, which is renowned as a place where people are quite aggressive to each other and quite, busy, if you go to a bar, say, it's the normal thing that you talk to the person next to you. That doesn't happen in London, does it? It is something specific about this city, isn't it? So you've got research from Miami. I don't know if it tells us anything about us.
I wonder if there's an aspect of fear in London. I don't know if that's just been kind of ramped up in the news, in that when I don't live in London anymore, I go back to my town, I do feel quite safe, whereas when I'm in London, I immediately put my guard up. And if someone does talk I would happily talk to them out. I'm quite a chatty person. But if it was at night and I'm a woman, I would always be that little bit worried that maybe this person has got some sinister intent while they're talking to me.
So you're making the transition from urban to less urban every day. Are you nicer when you're at home than when you're at work?
As I cross the border out of Greater London.
Okay, if this isn't a London thing, if this is about cities, could these problems that have been uncovered by the researchers in Florida, supposedly, be designed out of cities in the future? Is there a way to make our city environments a little bit more inclusive as the world becomes more populous? I'm
not sure there is, because I do think it is actually partly just a product of the denseness of the population. And I think part of the reason that you might be more likely to go to somebody's aid if you're in a rural area or a small village is that sense that there's nobody else there to help. It becomes a matter of personal responsibility. Whereas if you're walking down a busy street in a city and you see somebody who trips or falls, it's very easy to think, somebody else is slightly closer than me, somebody else is better equipped to help. And I think it is partly the sort of sense of embarrassment that you might not actually be able to help in this way, or you might be falling for some sort of scam, or all sorts of excuses that you make not to help.
Just to bring it directly into the week office, this actually happened to someone who works on the team. They had a really frightening encounter where they were accosted by a man who was holding a pair of scissors and who grabbed them and threatened them. And he said the most terrifying part was seeing everyone walk past. It happened right in the middle of a busy street at lunchtime. And he said people just walked by, and that sort of thing does happen all the time. And I've been guilty of it myself, not in that extreme of a scenario, but...
You've been guilty of ignoring, not going up to someone with a pair of scissors and threatening them.
But you do become quite inured. And when I think about some of the things, sometimes you're just walking past something crazy happening, and you think, God, if I was, back in my hometown, I would stop and stare and ring someone maybe. But, you do pass chances to intervene and maybe actually help people.
So if this is an innate problem with cities then, Holly, is it helpful that, as you alluded to, more and more of them are springing up around the world? I mean, especially with technology being what it is, I'm talking about the developed world now, I guess. People can work from home, etc. Should we be all living in the same place anyway if it's not good for us?
I wonder if more micro communities within cities will be the way of the future. I've lived in areas of London where it has been quite a nice kind of community feel down the road, or as far as the road extends. That's about it. Maybe little roads of people will get together, and there have been like village fetes and celebrations of royal jubilees and things like that. So I don't think it doesn't exist in London, just maybe it needs to be on a much smaller level.
I love it when people say that in London. It's really funny. So it's like it's real village mentality here. It's like, yeah, every house costs £5 million on this street. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Rebecca Gillie, Holden Frith and Holly Clemence. If you are using this podcast to divorce you from having to talk to the rest of the people in the city in which you live, at least tell your friends and colleagues about it on Twitter. We are at Week Unwrapped. You don't need to make eye-to-eye contact with them, but it's a great way to tell people about the show. Alternatively, another way to interact with the computer and tell real people that we exist is to write us a large review on Apple Podcasts explaining why we're brilliant. And of course, remember to hit subscribe to get the show every week direct to your device. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Thanks to our sponsor, Barclays Corporate Banking. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, a friendly bye-bye.